Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. It's great to see some folks entering today's webinar. We're so happy to have you here. Great. Well, we're going to get started. My name's Kim Krupa, and I lead network development and engagement for the Florida College Access Network. And we're thrilled to welcome you to Insights into Action, the next phase of Florida's statewide longitudinal data system. And yes, I have practiced. We're going to demystify this very exciting title today with our amazing lineup of experts and speakers. What we've learned is that Florida has built some impressive data infrastructure over the years, and we think that we're uniquely positioned to take the next step, which is connecting those education investments to real-world outcomes for students and families. So over the next hour, we'll hear all about that, exploring some opportunities to enhance our data system, and our experts will share their latest and greatest research findings and some really practical insights that we can all take back to our work. So let's get started. We've got lots of great stuff waiting for you. But first, as we dive in, let's just quickly share how you can engage with us today. You see the handles here on the screen. We really encourage you to drop your questions into the chat anytime during our conversation, and we will address them at the end during the Q&A. We will also make the recording and all the materials available. Our promise to you is that will come out within 1 week. And for those of you who are new to FCAN, welcome. We're so glad you're here. We lead the statewide collaborative movement to strengthen Florida by ensuring every Floridian attains education beyond high school toward a rewarding career. And our vision is a thriving Florida working together, where education is the pathway to economic mobility and a prosperous economy for all. And at FCAN, we work through multiple channels to strengthen Florida's talent pool. And today's focus is highlighted here. That longitudinal data sits right in the middle of our mission. It's really the heart of what we do. And for us, it's starting by following that student journey, right? From pre-K all the way through career, incredible insights that we like to celebrate and discover and really see which investments make a difference, which pathways lead to success, and where we can do even better. And today we'll explore how to make that work, our data systems work even more powerfully together. Here we are with our 7 conditions for success. This is really what guides FCAN's work, and today's conversation really connects to this highlighted condition here about effective use of data. All the data that we collect, the tremendous amount of information that we have, the challenge is really connecting those pieces so they answer the questions that we need answered and that people are asking. So which programs produce graduates who get hired? What early investments pay off years later? And how do different regions compare on career outcomes? So today you'll hear how Florida can really leverage its data infrastructure to provide those answers and more. We believe that when information is accessible and useful, that better decisions follow naturally. Before we hear from our experts and I pass the mic, we want to make sure that you have this on your calendar and invite your colleagues to join our 2026 Talent Strong Florida Summit. We're coming back to Tampa Bay, and we hope to see you all there. Registration actually opens next week on Wednesday, November 5th. Our call for proposals for breakout sessions is live. So consider submitting a proposal. We anticipate a really great lineup in 2026, including this very topic. Our proposals, we will close on November 14th at 5 p.m. So here is our agenda today. We'll start with some key highlights from the new research report that you will get at the end of the webinar. Then we'll hear from our expert panel with some commentary and discussion about the findings and opportunities ahead. Some of you submitted questions when you registered. We'll make sure we address those during the live Q&A at the end. And you can also engage directly with our presenters during that time. So please use the chat throughout. We really do want to hear what's popping into your head. So now I want to welcome all of our speakers and introduce our first two presenters who will be walking you through their comprehensive analysis. Welcome, Caroline Alexander from Alexander Research and Consulting and Gretchen Cheney from Paris Group. They conducted an extensive study of Florida's longitudinal data system, looking at peer states, identifying opportunities for Florida's next phase. Their 48-page report will be in your hands soon. But really some fascinating insights they're going to share about where we are and where the biggest opportunities lie ahead. After their presentation, they'll join our expert panelists for a discussion moderated by my incredible colleague, Dave Sobush, Director of Research and Policy at FCAN. But Caroline and Gretchen, welcome, and over to you to share what you discovered and what it means for Florida.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. I really appreciate it. It's nice to see everyone. Carol and I are going to tag team this presentation, but I'm going to start us off with some background and a look at Florida's statewide longitudinal data system, which, as Kimberly said, we shorthand as SLDS. Okay, moving to the next slide. Great. So just to provide a starting definition, with the things I would emphasize here are the terms student level and over time. Ideally, we are tracking each student's experience longitudinally as they move across from early childhood education into K-12, into post-secondary, and the workforce sector. So this data system is connecting all those student level records at multiple points in time. The next slide is really about kind of why SLDS matters. And for us, the power of SLDS, as Kimberly was suggesting, is not just linking the data and housing it in a common repository, but in mining it for insights and actionable information. So there's some examples here of how SLDS can be used. And one point I wanted to make is that there are a mix of audiences who really benefit from this data. And in this report, we really try to think about not only how would the data benefit the state agencies contributing the data, but others could benefit from having access to the data and the data reports as well. And that can include policymakers informing decision-making and investments, researchers contributing to the analysis, individual institutions understanding if their programs are effectively preparing students and how they might need to adjust those. Educators using the predictive data could think about how they might provide additional supports or make sure students get course access to maximize student success. And then finally, students and families making sure they're on track, meeting key milestones, and accessing those education and training programs that are really the most valuable and lead to credentials and positive employment outcomes. So all those things we want to keep in mind as you're writing the report. So next one is about this project in particular. So our task was to review Florida's SLDS history and current status and make some recommendations, knowing that Florida has this goal of being the top state for workforce education and talent development by 2030. So all states, not just Florida, have a strong interest in being very strategic and as nimble as possible in today's fast-changing economy to make sure their education and workforce investments stay aligned with those needs of the economy and employers. So the integrated data system can be a really useful tool in helping to guide decision making. And it does, however, require kind of continual improvements and updates to make sure the data is being used and to its maximum potential. So our presentation today is going to highlight lessons we learned from Florida and our national scan. So yeah, let's get to the next one. Okay, great. So here's some highlights from Florida in general. Just so you know, the SLDS is managed and maintained by the Florida Department of Education. And Florida is generally considered to be a very early adopter and pioneer in the effort to integrate cross-agency data. In the early 2000s, the Data Quality Campaign was a sort of early proponent of building linked and longitudinal data systems, and it recognized Florida in 2010 as being the first, and at that point, the only state who met all 10 of those essential elements in the data system. So, and Florida still is seen as one of the most comprehensive systems in the United States, and as of last year, it was still one of only 26 states across the country to link early childhood with K-12, post-secondary, and workforce all in one system. This is a quick snapshot of Florida's data system investments over time. Student level data collection began back in the 1980s. And then the Education Data Warehouse, which is the name of the SLDS, was established back in 2003. The federal government has been awarding competitive grants to states to support the building of integrated data systems, and Florida was awarded $14 million, which supported a variety of system enhancements over time. And then finally, I would note that the Florida Education Identifier, which is a data tool, was implemented to secure data privacy protections and allow for more accurate record linking. So over time, Florida has made a series of investments to expand the scope of their system, improve data linkages, and strengthen data security. So in our report, we looked at sort of five things, and one of the first things we looked at was the data components, trying to understand what was being inputted into the system. And Florida system is quite robust. It includes dozens of data sources from all these different points in time, from pre-K 12 into community colleges, adult education, post-secondary CTE. It also includes data from the state university system, and Florida Commerce has the workforce records. So all that data is being captured, and it's really including lots of details on like a student's demographic status, enrollment in courses, completion of courses, assessment results, earnings, social services data. All of that is encompassed in this larger data system. So that's fair. They get a lot of credit for building a very comprehensive system. The second thing we looked at in the next slide is on management and governance. We wanted to understand how it was organized. And according to the FDOE website, they've got an executive steering committee, which is made up of key leadership from within the Florida Department of Education. There's also an advisory board that includes members of the Florida Department of Education, plus representatives from the community college system, adult and career education, and the state university system. And then they're supported by two project teams. There's a leadership team and a management team sort of overseeing the daily operations and the reporting and the evaluation and the eventual reports that go up online. Next, we wanted to look at staffing and funding and to understand kind of state investments and internal capacity. Because the Florida budget, the FDOE budget, allocates funds by program, there's not a single line item specifically dedicated to the SLDS because it supports various programs, but you can see there is a specific line item for data hosting, and that is organized through that. The hosting site is the Northwest Regional Data Center, and that allocation was about almost $9 million last year. We also wanted to understand how Florida envisioned using the integrated and longitudinal data it was collecting. As I said, that really is sort of the goal. You do all the work to collect the data and bring it all together in an integrated system. We really want to make sure it's being used. We did not find a published research agenda for the SLDS that Florida puts out there. However, because researchers can request student level data, we did note on the external research request webpage that there is a bit of an indication about the research priorities aligned, that the Florida Department of Education is looking for. They're looking for these kind of four broad areas. They're interested in sort of the student achievement piece, obviously, as indicated by student learning gains. There's a particular interest in having how are students progressing and sort of looking specifically at targeted groups. There's an interest in the skilled workforce and economic development as measured by the evidence of employment and earnings. And then there's the quality efficient services. So those are kind of indications that if you're a researcher, they're looking for you to kind of make sure that your requests are aligned to those priorities. So that was an indication, but we did not see a specific research agenda aligned. Finally, we were interested in how the data are being analyzed, reported on, how accessible those reports were, and how the research community was able to access them. So the thinking here again is in the value of the data and its usefulness and accessibility to a wide range of audiences, as I mentioned earlier. Florida does produce quite a few reports on education outcomes. Some are done by single agencies and some are done cross-agency. We don't have them listed here, but you may be familiar with some of them. There's Florida Know Your Schools, which is a set of PK-12 dashboards. Florida Know Your Data is a more interactive tool. Florida Shines is a student-facing portal with planning tools, and that's a cross-agency data website. And then the university system has quite a few of its own reports. My Florida Future shows some of the post-college graduation data. There's data dashboards by the state university system as well. And then another cross-agency example is the Education Meets Opportunity platform, which is EMOP. So all these reports have their own platform or web page, and there really is no centralized hub or repository to help users locate the various tools and dashboards available. And we also noticed there was a wide variety in formatting. Some are Excel files, some are interactive, some are dashboards, but it was not a consistent format. And then in terms of external research access, we did, researchers can request data. However, the website makes it clear that some of the research requests can take several months to process, and research is supported as resources are available and may be limited in scope based on agency priorities. So that was another thing we noticed. Okay, so just to sort of, we thought we'd end the Florida portion, the sort of summary here, by sharing the state's stated SLDS goals, kind of to remind us of the purpose and the potential of these integrated data systems. If you look at the first two goals, they're very kind of focused on building strong data fundamentals, how to integrate the data and how to, make sure it's high quality and well linked. And this is obviously very important work. It requires kind of a cultural shift, a move in terms of, away from silos and do a much more integrated understanding of the education to workforce continuum. Um, and so that was important work. But then the third goal seemed to us to be more strategic. It's focused on how the data are leveraged to use and generate actionable information. And so we think the challenge for Florida and other states is to intentionally move from that kind of 1.0 thinking, that early phase of the work, and setting up the systems and establishing that culture of data sharing into the more strategic phases of the work as to how the data gets used. So we see Florida as well positioned to make that shift as it moves to achieve its goal of being, again, that top state in terms of workforce education and talent development. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Caroline and share the second part of our research and our recommendations for Florida.
Thank you, Gretchen. So our national peer comparison was the second part of our research, where we took a look at 7 different states, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, and Texas. And we chose those states because they were at different stages of their SLEDs development. They have been mentioned as having held up as examples in other areas, and they represented different areas of the country. And again, we looked at the same components that we looked at for Florida, focused on data components, management, governance, staffing, and funding, research agenda, and access. So on the data components, the common practice was that almost every state had the individual levels records that were linked from early childhood into the workforce. The only exception was that Nevada hadn't linked early learning yet. Many of the data components that were required as part of this SLEDs were codified into law, with the exception of Georgia. So that was what we identified as the common practice. The leading edge practice is the integration of additional agency data. Some of the states added in health and human services, criminal justice, and public safety. There were other states that added in national student clearinghouse data, which is a national data set that allows states to benchmark with other states, expand their tracking. And a key difference here is that the most leading edge states had fully integrated data sets, and that facilitates queries and research versus linking different data sets where there's periodic matching that's done. It could be quarterly or yearly, but that kind of limits the use of the data set. For management and governance, most of the states were governed by a board, and they had representation from all of the participating agencies. Many of them were independent or semi-independent from their participating agencies, and they were located at various underneath various departments. Some Department of Education, some in budget offices, others in governor's offices. But the leading edge practice is to extend the governance board beyond just the participating agencies and include other stakeholders like information technology, members of the public, other state agencies. Codifying the membership by statute or executive order is a leading edge practice. And a really key component of this area is the independence, because that helps alleviate some of the issues around accountability that can kind of complicate how data is released and research is made accessible. And it really allows the data system to be used more strategically to help improve and refine interventions along the way with a goal towards student success. So the common practice among the states for funding was to blend their funding, having a predictable state appropriation plus federal grants. Like Gretchen mentioned, the federal government has been a huge source of grants for standing up these longitudinal data systems. In addition, many of the state agencies were staffed with dedicated employees that had expertise in database management and analytics and project management, and importantly, in longitudinal research, so that in many systems, the data is looked at sort of at a point in time, but it's that longitudinal relationship where you can track students across the transition from one educational institution or stage of education to the next one that becomes really powerful. So having that expertise around longitudinal data or longitudinal research is really important. The leading edge practice for funding is to look for opportunistic grants for special projects and investments, tapping into private philanthropy, and then staffing wise to include a research expert that can liaise with internal and external stakeholders to really help promote the use of the data set and to promote inquiry and then promote the use of the findings to put them into action. Other funding is, for example, Texas charges cost recovery fees. And then Kentucky and KY Stats has done a really good job of tapping into private philanthropy to help fund some of their special projects. The research agenda is one where there's a lot of variability here. Some states just were like Florida, where they just had kind of general guidelines up of how what type of research they were looking for or wanted to prioritize with the longitudinal data. But the leading edge practice is that you have a department or committee that sets a research agenda that's aligned with your state's strategic priorities around education and workforce, and that those agendas are then promoted and publicized so that they can leverage the research community to align their research around their priorities. So Kentucky and Georgia and Michigan publish and promote really detailed agenda, and North Carolina actually goes out to all of their participating agencies to collect what their questions are, and and then they compile a list and look for cross-agency overlaps to really identify the goals that they want to focus on. And finally, access. The common practice is that they have a series of public-facing interactive reports that show cross-agency data linkages. So that means that it's not just a point in time in the K-12 system, but it's showing something, for example, students from K-12 with certain characteristics and maybe their employment outcomes later on, or their college graduation rates, or something that crosses, from one area of education to another one. And then the dashboards are usually targeted to families, students, and other audiences. And then they also often have reports that are targeted to policymakers, reporting accountability measures or key performance indicators. But the leading edge practice is really having active partnerships with an external research community. Michigan, for example, they have a educational research institute, and they have liaisons that work in between the longitudinal data system and the research community to ensure high quality proposals that are aligned with the state strategic goals. And that's one of the ways that they're able to really leverage the longitudinal data. Nevada also has a research grant program for external researchers where an external researcher can submit a proposal, gain access to their data, and their research would be funded through the state's grant funds. So those are two different examples. So comparing the Florida system with some of the national peers, the common practices and leading edge practices, we wanted to make some recommendations for Florida to improve and expand its data system, and then to build the research capacity and promote the use of the data system so that they can build the structure to uncover insights. And then make the research more available because they want to share out the insights to make it more actionable. So our first recommendation is to continue to invest in the SLDS, securing a dedicated funding stream, and then develop a continuous improvement plan so that you have really clear ideas and goals of what investments are needed for the SLDS and how it should be expanded. And then you can build funding and the governance structure and the data sets around that continuous improvement plan. So once you have the plan, then you can pursue grants to fund projects that align with that plan. You can extend the governance structure to include more participating agencies, hopefully establish a more independent agency that oversees the data system and integrate critical data sets into it, and hopefully join the national data sharing partnerships like the National Student Data Clearinghouse or the post-secondary employment outcomes, so that you'll be able to compare outcomes in Florida with other states. The next recommendation is to build research capacity internally and externally and promote the use of the data system. So first, develop a research agenda collaboratively with all of the participating agencies, K-12, state university system, the workforce system, and make sure that that research agenda is aligned with state goals for student success and workforce development. Next, establish an executive level data liaison and support staff that will be really charged with supporting research using the SLDS. And then launch a statewide campaign aimed at education and workforce stakeholders to really promote the value and the use of connected data so that you can drum up more business in the research in terms of research requests in the external research community. And the third recommendation is to make sure that all of the findings from this augmented research capacity is more accessible and that it's in usable formats that are really targeted to the specific audiences that will use them. So creating a more comprehensive repository so that the reports are easier to find, establish standards for reporting so that there's less variability between the reports and the dashboards, and even using data usage metrics to make sure that you understand which reports are being used and how they're being used, so that you can inform any improvements of the reports. And with that, I think I pass it back over to Dave.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline and Gretchen, for walking us through the research. I'd ask that you please stick around for a little bit. I want to make sure your findings and the opportunities you identified, I'm sure they've prompted some questions from our audience. It's now my pleasure. I'd like to introduce and invite our panelists to activate their cameras and join me here on screen. Caroline, if you could go ahead and stop sharing. Sharing's caring, and sometimes not sharing is caring even more. Each of our panelists represents a different sector of data user, policy, business organization, and philanthropy, but each of them has a similar need for good data to inform the work they do. We'll jump in with some questions from me, but as you in the audience are thinking about your data needs for the work you do, we invite you to share those key questions about education and ultimately student and workforce success, those questions you would love to be able to answer with a next generation leading edge student longitudinal data system. Data is a tremendously important topic throughout the world of college access and college attainment. In fact, if you haven't, after you read our report, I'd make sure that you would read, if you haven't already, Bill DeBond's from the National College Attainment Network, his blog post from last week talking about how states are and aren't sharing post-secondary outcome data, some snapshots from the field. Let me see. Caroline, would you mind unsharing your screen, please?
I think she's trying.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. There's not a button to unshare. There's only a button to share. But maybe
sharing just goes one way in this regard. Well, as you work on that, you folks, and there we go. That's amazing. Terrific. We'll jump in right now. I'm gonna, ladies first, we'll go to Adriana. In many ways, the origin story of ExcelinEd is one that's rooted in the public availability of data. Talk to us, if you would, a little bit about your work and the importance of strong state data systems for better public policy. And if you can, try to weave in, please, a favorite example of how good data has informed great policy in service to student outcomes, whether that's here in Florida or given your national perspective.
Thank you so much. Really thrilled to be here. So, ExcelinEd is a national policy organization that works across college and career pathways, literacy, accountability, choice, founded by Florida's wonderful governor, Jeb Bush, who's our chair, and still leans in heavily in the work. And anyone who's interacted with Governor Bush has probably heard him say, what get measures gets done. That was a driving principle of his leadership in Florida and for our work here at ExcelinEd as an organization. And so working and honing in on the college and career pathways space, there's a tremendous opportunity to really think about outcomes data and the power of a strong longitudinal data system. Thinking about the quality of career and technical education or what students are doing when they graduate high school, data has to be at the forefront in decision making, and looking at Keith and the great work that the DOE has done with their CTE audit. But I think states are just starting to unpeel the onion of what can really be possible when you look at data, especially and like break it out by region or break it out by student group to really dig into what's possible. So I am in Nashville, was formerly TDOE here, and I'm going to share a Tennessee example. So last year we looked at the industry recognized credentials that either the state was promoting, which means they had it on the list, or that students were earning. So when you looked for what was on the list that met the demand for employers, and we use Lightcast data, across K-12 and post-secondary, it was only 10%. So that's a big value signal. If a state has put a credential on a list and said, here's what we think students should be earning, and it's not meeting employer demand, that's a really big flag. And then the numbers were better when you looked at what was actually earned. So for K-12, 56% of what was earned for credentials was meeting employer demand, but 50% of those were general career readiness. So we're talking about the OSHA 10s, the kind of building blocks when we think about a credential. So what we would love to have Tennessee do is to follow the model that Indiana has worked on, where they are putting a stake in the ground around what they're calling a credential of value. And they're using the big C credential. So for if you are a 2-year, they haven't gone up to bachelor's yet, but including 2-year degrees and industry recognized credentials and tiering all of those together. Because then students can get a holistic sense of if I earn this in high school, if I bank enough to get an associate degree, like what's the value for me as a learner? So we think there's tremendous opportunity to think about leveraging the data. And we think about it in the 4 buckets of transparency, right? Giving folks the information that they need, incentivizing it at the state level, structural changes that need to happen. No one likes to retire a program of study, but sometimes you have to. And enforcement, like are there mechanisms where you're removing funding? Things like that. So huge policy opportunities to think about the power of the data.
Yeah, that's an amazing story and a tough one to follow. And Keith, that job of following it falls to you. So the Florida Chamber Foundation has long been both a believer and a leader in using data to galvanize business and civic leaders, whether to call attention to issues, monitor progress, and celebrate, some of the great wins Florida has had. Share a little bit about the foundation's data leadership and tools, and if you would, similar as I asked Adriana, please tell us data's greatest success in uniting Florida's businesses for good.
Thanks, Dave. When folks sometimes think of the Florida Chamber and the Florida Chamber Foundation, sometimes they first think about economic data analysis. But that's not what the Florida Chamber Foundation is exclusively all about. One of our 6 pillars of the Florida 2030 Blueprint, which is our vision, our long-term strategic plan for the entire state of Florida, is a pillar based on the talent supply. So the talent supply and workforce development. And our chamber members and our chamber foundation members are highly invested in understanding what's going on with our current talent supply, starting all the way in pre-kindergarten through high school into post-secondary, for a few reasons. One is related to their core business mission and making sure that there's alignment with the skills and the talent that's coming into the workforce to meet their needs. And a second reason is also tied to their corporate philanthropy and their community investment. And so we have a few tools at the Florida Chamber that folks in the business community regularly tap into to help inform both of those sides of that coin. So one of those is the floridascorecard.org, where we have a range of measures, including some education indicators that business leaders track and monitor, both economic indicators and education indicators at the statewide level and the county. We have a second data tool called the Florida Gap Map, and that one is revolved around the 10 root causes of poverty. And it looks at education data and access to quality education and attainment of credentials as one of the factors in a complex story related to root causes of poverty. And that data tool, the floridagapmap.org, is something that our business leaders use and look at the zip code level. So as part of their investment strategies and their community engagement, can see in specific neighborhoods all the way down to that granular zip code level what's going on with these indicators and these education indicators. And then our newest data tool is one that was recently funded by the Helios Education Foundation, and it's the Florida Talent Center Data Hub. And it's comprised of 4 separate robust dashboards that look at this continuum all the way from pre-kindergarten into the workforce. And that's a tool that our business leaders are utilizing to look at the talent pipeline and the production of degrees, certificates, and credentials that align with their workforce needs. And one of the really exciting examples that we heard from at our recent Prosperity Summit that we had a few months ago was from Tim Marks at the, yep, you're nodding your head there, at Metropolitan Ministries, who told a really powerful story, because that's right there in the Tampa area. And Metropolitan Ministries, an association, and their funding comes from private sector, from government, and community foundation, public sector, and they have business investors who help fund their mission. Folks like Bank of America, Florida Blue, just to name a couple, who want to see their community investment dollars be used effectively in their communities. And so what we heard from Tim Marks is that they've been using the Florida Gap Map to target specific neighborhoods at the zip code level that are the most vulnerable. And looking at certain metrics, they were really honing in on childhood poverty to target 6 specific neighborhoods. And then once they had used the Florida Gap Map and this data-informed approach to identify where they wanted to focus their work, they were using that view of these different root causes of poverty, like educational attainment, access to transportation, different issues with healthcare, to get an understanding of within those communities, using that data to inform how they might be investing in interventions to help those unique challenges across the communities. So we always get excited when we see our business community investing their philanthropic investments and getting engaged in communities using a data-informed approach.
Yeah, that's terrific. And I think you've really highlighted, Keith, the importance of data, point-in-time data to triage or diagnose. And I think the power of longitudinal data is better prescriptions and, ultimately a better cure. Thank you for sharing that. Bill, coming to you with sort of a similar question. The Florida Philanthropic Network works in so many areas to unite grant makers and build a better Florida. So talk about the work that FPN does specific to education and how specifically an enhanced statewide longitudinal data system could strengthen those efforts. And if you've got a particular example of how access to good data informed great grant making, what was the issue and what was the outcome with that? Would love to hear a great success story from the philanthropic sector.
Sure. And thanks for inviting us in. We appreciate being part of this conversation. For those who don't know, FPN is a member network. It's got over 140 grant-making organizations in Florida, and the majority of them work in education. Now, for the latest figures we have, just to give you an idea of scope, the FPN members have over $13.5 billion in assets. And for the last grant-making year, issued over 18,500 grants, exceeding $1.1 billion. So at that level, you can imagine it's not the old-time concept of philanthropy. We're going to do this because it makes us feel good or because we have more and we want to help others. There is a very definite expectation with this level of philanthropy that there is a measurable return on investment. And that, Keith, you actually gave an excellent example, not necessarily in education, but similarly, we have funders who they're making decisions daily where they're going to be investing. And if they do not have access to data and do not have access to results, then they're just going to invest somewhere else. So from an education standpoint, I think the longitudinal data systems are critical. I've had conversations with funders, national funders, who they make a decision whether or not they're going to even invest anywhere in Florida. And with those conversations, I had a number of people who commented the long-term longitudinal data that Florida's got has really directed national resources into Florida that would otherwise go to some other state. So I think our historical access to data has been it's been really helpful. And that's not to say that there isn't some frustration with funders in getting easy access to data. I guess as far as examples, there's a bunch of them out there, but
What's
maybe
your
some of the
favorite
best
one?
ones are with the local college access networks, the LCANs. For people who are familiar with them, they know that these are partnerships not only with educational organizations, but also with community and business leaders. And business leaders, again, we didn't coordinate this, but Keith already shared, they are looking for investments where there are measurable results. And I think a great early example is the local college access network in the Tampa Bay area here, LEAP, where they really had their efforts supercharged early on when they created a Fuse scholarship, and they had a number of very large donations come in to start that. And I had conversations with the funding organizations. The only reason they invested was because they knew that they were going to be getting reliable results out of this investment. And that continues. And I do believe that there is a direct correlation between being able to get feedback. And by the way, that may mean feedback that their investments aren't working. That's okay. They want the real story, whether or not it's success or whether or not they understand maybe an area failing where they can tweak and improve. But that leads to more philanthropic investments.
Excellent, excellent. And that's good program outcomes are always important, for any sort of investment. Education is the third largest bucket in the state budget, and there's a few critical questions that remain a little bit elusive to answering readily. And so that's a reminder, sort of a ham-handed reminder for the audience. Please let us know what are the questions you'd like to have at your fingertips to be able to answer with better longitudinal data. Before I invite Caroline and Gretchen back up, I want to ask sort of a little lightning round. We'll go in the opposite order we did. So Keith, you're still in the middle. And so I just want us to say, before Caroline and Gretchen come back, of the research that they shared, of all the opportunities which they presented as recommendations, what in your mind would be the most impactful one were it to be realized? And so Bill, we'll start with you.
I think it was the third recommendation, which is easily accessible dashboards. We have funders who don't have data nerds on staff and don't want to have to dig too deeply to find the information that they want. And, I think the more accessible and publicly facing these data are, the more that we're going to get some of the folks who are maybe on the edge that they want to invest in measurable results in education.
Terrific. Keith?
I'm going to go with recommendation number 2. And that's because it's based on an experience I had over the past year working on a research report related to math proficiency and high quality math instruction. And we learned that this was a very important and relevant topic to our business leader community. Folks like leadership at Florida Power and Light, at RS&H architecture firm, at Boeing, very concerned about these issues related to math and math proficiency. And knowing and understanding the wants and needs of the business community is one thing, But to be able to articulate that into robust research projects that really leverage the longitudinal data sets that weren't something we were able to leverage in the timeline for this research project. It was a cross-sectional research project. That type of work and those findings could be greatly enhanced if there was more research capacity, both internally and externally, to utilize the longitudinal aspect of the data to dig into things that we know the business community is concerned about.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Adriana, you can double down on either Keith or Bill. You can make one of them happy, another one sad, or you can, choose a middle path and choose something else. But of the recommendations and opportunities, what would be the most impactful in your mind, given your role at ExcelinEd?
Well, this worked out great for me because I had actually picked a Frankenstein answer, where I paired extend the governance structure to beyond K-12, which was in recommendation 2, and then create a more structured research agenda, which was in recommendation 3, because I think once you broaden out that governance, hone in on like a strategic priority for the state across that could have real power for driving change.
Yeah, yeah, terrific. That I'm going to invite Caroline and Gretchen and our hostess, Dr. Kim Krupa, back on. And Kim, you mentioned we had some questions that came through with the registration, and I don't know if any have come through in the interim while I've been smiling at the camera and looking at myself and saying, "Gosh, I could have done something better with my hair." But Kim, why don't you go ahead and any questions for the group?
Absolutely. And people who registered were able to ask questions without even reading the report. So some of them are a little bit broad, but I think you all are up for the challenge. Um, for the states, and if Florida had an integrated data system, as you describe in the research, what are they doing differently? Like, how are they waking up on a Monday morning? What's different in those states? What decisions are they making? How are students maybe not falling through the cracks between systems? Just can you bring that to life a little bit?
Sure, I can use one of the examples of a regional partnership that we looked at as part of this research to kind of bring that to life. The CFEED example, which is the Orange County Public Schools and Valencia College and University of Central Florida. And but there's another county too.
Orange.
Dave. Orange.
Gretchen mentioned it. Yeah. Orange.
Okay. But what I was really impressed with was that they would coordinate a research project between all of the different levels of education that were there. They would answer the question, bring that insight up, and then they would take it back to the school systems to modify or inform the student level intervention. So for example, if they find students that take well, there was a populations of students that were ready to take advanced level classes in high school that hadn't taken them yet. And that was a key driver of success in post-secondary education that they were focused on. So they were able to identify the college readiness factors, look at the K-12 students that had those characteristics, identify which specific students were ready to take the classes and then actually talk to those students and get them to sign up for the advanced level classes. So they were really using the insights to inform specific actions and interventions at the student level.
Yeah, I would complement that with we have some examples in the report from what other states are doing. And I think we tend to think of the things like CTE programming or college programs. Do they actually result in students getting credentials and degrees that they intended to? But I think some other things that came up, which I may not be top of mind, are Kentucky looked at their summer youth employment programming to see if that generated longer term outcomes for folks. And when they saw that it did, they invested more heavily in their summer programming. Texas looked at their teacher certifications and found, that uncertified teachers were having sort of a drain on student performance. And so they were really trying to make sure that they're really getting certified folks in front of students in classrooms. So there's lots of different ways you can, chronic absenteeism data, you can look and see like what is the impact of that on students long term. So lots of state examples about how they've done this. Another thing that came to mind is that there's a real need for data literacy and understanding of how to unpack and use this data. And some states have sort of taken a role of helping to train folks at multiple levels in the system about how do you make use of this data, understand it, analyze it, and have it generate information that can be used.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for jumping in on that one. This next question is about maybe Bill and Keith and anyone, of course, but when you're maybe looking at education and workforce development, what kind of outcome data do you wish you had, maybe not 2 years ago, but live that we don't right now? Like, what are some of those pain points that you're experiencing when you're trying to answer questions about the state of our state and our students?
I'll let Keith go first. He's chomping at the bit there.
And one of the areas that would be a game changer for the state of Florida would be enhanced wage records. And Florida already does an amazing job through a multi-agency data sharing agreement to get wage records from employers into the hands of the Florida Department of Education. And an office does robust analyses across sectors to track if graduates are employed and their average annualized earnings. But to enhance those wage records, to include some indicator of job title that could then be crosswalked into a SOC code, and to enhance those wage records to include a different data point on salary or hourly wage would really be a game changer to allow the business community to have strong data to clearly see the pathways and pipelines between specific CTE programs of study and specific occupations. And that's something that I know Florida has explored and other states have explored. But in order to make that feasible, it really would need to be done in a way that is manageable by all these businesses across Florida. So doing it in a very strategic way would be important.
So, Kim, from philanthropy's standpoint, the guiding statement for the education funders is that from early learning through K-12 through post-secondary, it's all about creating graduates who can engage in a meaningful career. And there's a lot of sort of disparate information out there, much of it lagging behind real time. And your question was around real time. I think if there was tighter from a handoff to those different levels and be from a timeliness standpoint, they'd feel more comfortable making bigger investments in something that's going to help fulfill that guiding statement.
Wonderful. Anyone else want to chime in on a pain point before we share the much anticipated QR code to this wonderful report?
I think we'd be here all day. I'll respond in the blog to sort of my dream data thing. So that's the hook for people to read the blog when it comes out.
Thank you so much, Dave. So without further ado, thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. And here is the QR code for this research report. We encourage you all to take a picture. It will bring you right to the 48-page report that we promised you. We can't wait to follow up, hear your reactions, your insights, your questions that this raises for you, the questions that you can't answer without this sort of actionable data that we're talking about today. And we appreciate you all tuning in. And again, we'll have the show notes, Dave's questions, and everything else that you need to bring this back to your communities and share with your colleagues within the next week. So thank you all for joining us today. I'll leave this up as we close out the webinar. Thank you all so much to the panelists.